Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. I'm Katharine Van Tassel. I'm currently visiting professor of law here at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm actually from Cleveland. I've been gone for about 20 years. I went to Case Western Reserve University Law School, graduated and clerked for William K. Thomas, federal district court judge. I don't know how many people remember Judge Thomas. After that point, I worked in Cleveland for almost a decade before I made the transition into teaching. Most recently, I've been the dean of the San Francisco Law School, but I have a 12-year-old and I wanted my son to have the same kind of growing up experience that I had here in Cleveland. It's a wonderful place to raise a family, so I'm home for the first time in 20 years, and I want to say thank you to all of you for welcoming me here to the City Club to speak to you this morning about my topic, regulating nanotechnology in the space between and the creation of the public health product safety net. And so, folks, as we're listening along, this is a nice small group, so anytime you have a question, you can raise your hand. If it's something that I think I'm going to cover in the slides in just a few minutes, I'll just say I'm going to bracket your question. And I promise to get to it, but you can hold me accountable. Put your hand back up and say, wait a minute, you never covered that question. That way we can actually start a dialogue. I'll probably speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions about what you think we should be doing as we face an increase in these kinds of nanoparticles in our consumer products. So just a little aside before I start into the presentation, I want to point out that the risk to public health from nanotechnology comes from several types of exposures. Worker exposures from making nanotech products and handling products at the end of their life. Environmental exposures from manufacturing or garbage. And consumer exposure to nanotech products. And so in this presentation, I'm pretty narrowly focusing on consumer exposure to nanotech products. And I hope to be able to answer the following questions about nanotechnology for you today. What is it? Where is it? What consumer products contain nanoparticles? What are the health risks associated with exposure to it? What does the FDA regulate? Will the CDC's early warning and recall system work to prevent an injury epidemic if a nanotech product causes serious injuries? What can a consumer do, if anything, to engage in self-protection? If a consumer is injured, can he or she recover under the tort system? How is the European Union handling nanotech consumer products? And finally, I'll share with you my proposal for how the FDA could regulate nanotech products and products using other innovative technologies that have never been seen before in nature to both protect public health while encouraging innovation. Starting with the first question, what is nanotechnology? According to the National Nanotechnology Initiative, nanoscience is a science and art of manipulating matter at the nanoscale to create new and unique materials and products. Well, what does that mean, and how small is small? This cartoon is a good introduction to the concept. Oh, let's go back a little bit. Here we go. To help you visualize just how small we are talking here, let's start with the picture of an ant carrying a microchip that is 1 million nanometers in size. 1 million nanometers is the size of the head of a pin. This virtual robot on the head of a pin is still 500,000 nanometers in size. So this robot is not a nanorobot, it's way too big. One ragweed pollen is 20,000 nanometers. One red blood cell is 2,500 nanometers. Here's a picture of a small virtual robot injecting medications directly into a red blood cell. But this robot is still not a nanorobot. It's too big at 2,500 nanometers in size. And finally, 1 nanotube is 2 nanometers. So when we're talking small, we're talking really small. On the other hand, the nanotech product market is huge and is growing daily. Thousands of tons of nanotech products are produced each year. Globally, over $7.3 billion in nanotech manufactured goods are produced yearly. Experts are predicting that the global market in nanotech products will reach $16.8 billion per year by 2022. So where are these nanoparticles being used? Nanoproducts include sporting goods, cell phones, digital cameras, coatings for eyeglasses, paints, stain-resistant clothing, odor-eating socks, light-emitting diodes used in computers. It also includes stain-resistant nanotech fabrics used to create bed sheets, athletic apparel, ties, and car seats. These kind of nanotech household products are available through dozens of retailers, including Banana Republic, Britex, Savain, and JCPenney. Nanotech stain-resistant fabric is also being used in new lines of furniture. These kinds of products cause less public health concern because they contain fixed nanoparticles. In other words, they're contained in a solid matrix. Of more health concern to consumers are free nanotech particles, which are particles suspended in liquids that are easily absorbed by the body. For example, liquid cleaners that are likely to be in your kitchen cabinets as we speak. Currently, one of the largest categories of products that use nanoparticles in liquid form are cosmetics. Here we can see the common brand of skin cream, Lancome. The most common form of nanoparticle used in cosmetics are called fullerenes, commonly called buckyballs. Buckyballs are less than 50 nanometers in size. You can see that they look like hollow soccer balls. Here's a picture of what buckyballs actually look like. With buckyballs, a cosmetic manufacturer allegedly puts whatever skin treatment molecules they want into the middle of the buckyball. The buckyball is then absorbed into the deep layers of your skin and then allegedly releases its cargo at its proper destination. We'll talk about what that destination might actually be in just a few slides. Other products applied directly to the skin include products like wipes and lotions for babies. L'Oreal is a brand that appears to currently use the most nanoparticle content based on patent applications review. Here is a bestseller, L'Oreal Revitalift. L'Oreal claims that its product delivers nutrients like vitamin A, retinol, or beta-carotene deep into your skin. According to L'Oreal, the deeper they penetrate the skin, the more effective they are in fighting signs of aging. Almost all sunscreens on the market today now use nanoparticles. Older sunscreens use zinc oxide to block the sun's rays. Some of us in this room are old enough to recall how white and pasty it was. Now sunscreens contain nano zinc oxide or nano titanium dioxide, making the sunscreen translucent. It applies in a clear, easily spreadable form. I'll be referring to the health risks associated with nano titanium dioxide in just a few minutes. Then there are nano products that are marketed for direct ingestion. Sausage is one of the first entries into this category. Dietary supplement manufacturers are jumping onto the nanotech bandwagon in a big way. Now there's over 119 food products that contain nanoparticles. Kraft, Campbell Soup, Cargill, General Mills, DuPont, Heinz, Hershey, Mars, Nestle, PepsiCo, Sara Lee, and Unilever, among others, are all carrying out research for the use of nano food products. Other nanoproducts use nanotech clays, including Miller Brewing bottles, specifically Miller Lite, Miller Genuine Draft, and Ice House brands, and one of my favorite brews, Corona. On the market now are antibacterial tableware and plastic wrap with nano-silver coating marketed to kill bacteria. One area of large growth is the use of nanotech packaging for bakery, meat, fruit, and vegetables, and other processed food products. Marketing experts opine that the key drivers of this trend are favorable food regulations, in other words, as you will learn, very little regulation, and increasing demand for packaging that can enhance shelf life, maintain product quality, and improve trackability. How does this work? Silver interferes with the bacterial growth by disrupting the cell membrane, binding to the DNA of cells, and blocking the metabolism of bacteria. You will see that nanoparticles in Curade Band-Aids, which specifically instruct the nanoparticle content needs to be plastered onto the open wound. Some of the new products on the market even surprised me. Here, nanotech toothpaste. If you see the label antimicrobial, there is a good possibility that it contains nanosilver. This graph shows the remarkable growth in new nanotech products in just an 8-year period of time, from 54 different nanotech products in 2005 to 1,628 different nanotech products in 2013. And these numbers do not include the hundreds of products that don't disclose the fact that they contain nanoparticles. Looking at the question of where nanoparticles are, they're also located in your body in steadily increasing amounts. Remember the most common type of nanoparticle, the buckyball? What happens to these buckyballs after we spread them on our skin when we use moisturizers, or inhale them when we share off our cosmetics, shampoos, and creams? Or we ingest them as part of our food, or when we lick our lips after we use lipstick glossy with nanoparticles or nano chapstick. What happens to these nanoparticles after they are absorbed by our body? The answer is that nanoparticles are highly mobile. Nanoparticles can enter the bloodstream through the lungs, skin, and GI tract. When they are released into the air, they can enter into your brain through your olfactory nerve. They can easily slip unhindered into bone marrow, muscles, the liver, and spleen, and into the cells themselves. Once inside your cells, they bind to cellular structures, move through the cytoplasm, and lodge in the mitochondria. These tiny particles can cross the blood-brain barrier, and during pregnancy, they can cross the placenta to enter the fetus. And of most concern, they can bioaccumulate. In other words, the amount of nanoparticles in your brain, your lungs, and your cells can build up over time. According to the FDA, should we be worried about all these nanoparticles bioaccumulating in our body? No, no worries. Up until just 4 years ago, the FDA took the position that particle size does not matter. The FDA's regulatory scheme was based upon a presumption of bioequivalence. This meant that if the FDA had concluded that the macroparticle version of the material was safe, then the nanoparticle version was also safe. This meant that the FDA did not require manufacturers to list nano ingredients on labels. What we now know is that with scientific certainty is that nano does not just mean smaller, it means fundamentally different. Nanoparticles are different in optical, magnetic, bioaccumulation, toxicity, electrical, chemical, explosiveness, and persistence characteristics. These different properties create unique human health and environmental risks. Why are nanoparticles different? There is one major reason. The laws of classical physics do not apply. The laws of quantum mechanics and quantum chemistry apply to nanotech particles. This means that nanoparticles behave in very different ways than their bulk counterparts. Now we understand the smaller the particle, the more molecules there are on the surface of the molecule. As you can see here, if a particle of 90 millimeter size, about 10% of its molecules are expressed on the surface, whereas at 10 and 3 nanometers in size, the ratios increase to 20% and 50% respectively. Now, the poison is in the size, not in the dose. What does that mean to the FDA's regulatory position on bioequivalency? Scientists have been in agreement for over a decade that an understanding of the health risks of particles in their bulk form is not predictive of risks on a nanoscale. Toxicity of nanoparticles is greater than the same mass of larger particles. So the FDA's presumption that nanoparticles are safe if their bulk counterparts are safe was no longer scientifically supportable. In the face of mounting criticism in 2014, the FDA finally changed its stance on bioequivalency and issued a position statement acknowledging the unique nature and risks of nanoparticles. So does that mean the FDA has stepped in to regulate nanotech and consumer products? Unfortunately, no. The FDA has adopted a watch and wait stance. In its guidance documents for industry, it points out the unique properties of nanotech that I just discussed with you and invites industry to consult with the FDA. Consulting with the FDA before marketing a cosmetic, food, or dietary supplement is purely voluntary. And just as the situation with vaping and e-cigarette industry, you can imagine just how many manufacturers have taken the FDA up on its offer. In my mind, this cartoon accurately reflects the current state of the regulation of nanotech consumer products, including cosmetics, food, and dietary supplements. Should we, the consumers, be concerned with the FDA's decision that regulatory protection is not necessary and that it can just watch and weight? Well, almost a decade after the FDA adopted the presumption of bioequivalency between macro and nanoparticles, and then switched to its position of watch and wait, we also have learned more about the health risks associated with exposure to nanoparticles. What do scientists understand about the harm that nanoparticles can cause? The major concerns are that they cause structural damage to the cells that causes an asbestos-like effect, and damage to the DNA that may cause cancer, and that they may clog phagocytes and having an HIV-like effect. I'd like to focus for a moment on one form of nanoparticle, the multi-walled carbon nanotube. These are the bad boys of nanotech particles. Here's what it actually looks like. It looks very similar to an asbestos fiber, long, needle-thin, and spiky. A massive coordinated study by 70 researchers from 7 universities and the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health suggests that multi-walled carbon nanotubes not only look like asbestos fibers, they cause the same type of damage to the lungs. Rats that were exposed to these fibers develop lesions that are similar to asbestosis and mesothelioma within a short time of exposure. One case study revealed that 2 women factory workers in China may have won the dubious distinction of being the first human beings known to have been killed from exposure to nanoparticles. 7 previously healthy young women all showed up at the same hospital with an unusual and rapidly progressing lung disease. The doctors were surprised to learn that all 7 had worked together in the same very small room in a local factory for about 5 to 12 months prior to the onset of their illnesses. The workers sprayed a nanoparticle polyurethane coating on boards, heated the boards and dried them, and were exposed to the fumes with no breathing masks in 10 to 12-hour shifts. All 7 of the disease workers had pleural effusions, pulmonary fibrosis, and granulomas similar to the physical injuries found in the rat study I just described. All of the workers had similarly sized nanoparticles in their chest fluid and lung cells. In spite of the doctor's best efforts, all had a rapid progression of disease and 2 quickly died of respiratory failure. 3 have long-term progressive lung disease, and the health of the others is unknown because they were lost to follow-up. This is what the nanoparticles look like. They were multi-walled carbon nanotubes coated with nano titanium dioxide. Now, titanium dioxide is normally inert physically, not bioreactive. But the smaller the particle, the more bioreactive and toxic it becomes. The manufacture of titanium dioxide nanoparticles is a huge industry, producing well over 2 million tons per year. 70% of the pigments worldwide contain titanium dioxide nanoparticles. Nanopigments are highly light reflective, making the pigments very bright. This makes these nanotech particles very popular for the use in lipsticks and other cosmetics. In addition to paint, cosmetics, sunscreens, and vitamins, these nanoparticles can be found in toothpaste, food colorants, nutritional supplements, and hundreds of other personal care products. The sparkles in children's toothpastes are likely nano-titanium dioxide. Nano-titanium dioxide also has an aesthetic function. When organic matter like dirt comes into contact with these nanoparticles, it is oxidized at an increased rate and decomposes into water and carbon dioxide. So walls painted with nanopaint actually continuously shed dirt, leaving the walls looking cleaner. Bare exterior paint contains 4 to 20 pounds of zinc oxide and titanium dioxide nanoparticles per 100 gallons. It advertises that it provides a one-coat system for the exterior of buildings that can replace the old prime and paint system with long-lasting coatings that resist environmental degradation. 15 years ago, Dockers incorporated nanotechnology into the fabric of their ubiquitous casual pants with the introduction of Go Khaki with Stain Defender. At the time, these khakis were pretty revolutionary. Now, some claim that we'll be able to throw away our clothes dryers and clothes washers in the very near future, as clothes with nanosilver will not only self-clean when exposed to light, but will have antibacterial properties. Cumulatively, the U.S. government has invested nearly $29 billion since 2001 in nanotech research and development. And the President's 2020 budget requests over $1.4 billion for investment in research and technology into nanotech innovation. However, as you can see, only 4% of this money is being invested into research into the health and environmental impacts of this new technology. So now that the FDA has acknowledged that nanoparticles are not bioequivalent to their bulk equivalent, and the state of the science today is clear that there are increased and serious health risks associated with at least some nanoparticles, the next question becomes whether this new state of scientific understanding changed the way the FDA regulates nanotechnology. Unfortunately, as you may have guessed, because I'm here talking about it, we are still here, with very little to no regulation of everyday consumer products that use nanotechnology. Why is this the case, you ask? To answer this question, we need to look at what phase of the scientific cycle we're in. The science on health risks normally goes through 3 phases. Ignorance, when the scientists don't know what they don't know. Indeterminacy, when the scientists know what they don't know but can plan the scientific experiments necessary to find out. And then finally, the state of science will reach a tipping point when the risks are actually quantifiable. As I explained, the FDA's regulatory presumption of bioequivalence was made when the state of scientific understanding of the role of particle size was ignorance. So it took no steps to regulate. Now the FDA has acknowledged that nanoparticles pose health risks, but the state of the science on health risks still is in indeterminates. So the FDA can't quantify the health risks. In other words, it does not have sufficient evidence to make a finding that a particular nanoparticle in a particular quantity or concentration poses a health hazard when used in a particular way to a particular group of people. The good news is that when the science is indeterminates, the scientists know what they don't know and are actively involved in studies to find out the actual health consequences of nanoparticles. However, until the FDA has enough data to use classic risk analysis to quantify the risk and label certain type of nanoparticles hazardous, it can't regulate that type of nanoparticle. This means that until science can quantify it, the FDA's hands are tied. This is a problem that arises repeatedly when the development of an innovative new technology outpaces the development of the science necessary to identify its health risks. Other examples, when there was a long lag time of between 30 to 100 years between the introduction of new exposure and an understanding of the health risks associated with those exposures, include medical x-rays, lead, benzene, asbestos, PCBs, CFCs, TBTs, DES, thalidomide, just to name a few. When the state of the science is in ignorance or indeterminacy, public health regulators like the FDA are operating in what I call the space between, or in the health risk information void. What does that mean to the consumer? According to the FDA, since it's uncertain that the health risks are from consumer exposures to nanoparticles, nano content is not material. Since the nano content is not considered to be material, there is no need to list it as an ingredient on the product label. The FDA normally plays a gatekeeper role, keeping unsafe products off the market. Under our current system, the FDA is not able to fulfill this role, and nanoparticles are being introduced into the market at an escalating rate. The question then becomes, will the CDC's early warning system prevent an injury epidemic like what's happening now with vaping products? It's unlikely for 3 reasons. First, nanotech ingredients are not listed on labels. Second, because it's not listed on the labels, the consumer is not aware of the new exposure. So consumers and their doctors can't report the new exposure and injury connection to the CDC or the FDA. And the CDC and FDA can't collect any data on nanotech injuries and the cause of those injuries. Without access to data, the product recall system has been short-circuited. If the government isn't acting in its role to protect consumers, can the consumer engage in self-protection and simply avoid these products? No, unfortunately, nanotech ingredients are usually not listed on labels, so consumers can't avoid these products. I just learned yesterday that all of the products used in the hair salon where I just moved here to get my hair cut are made by L'Oreal, which uses the greatest amount of nanomaterial in its cosmetics and hair products in the industry. The small room is not well ventilated, so the smell is very strong, and the women are exposed who work there in the salon and the customers to particles at what I suspect is a high level of exposure. So if a consumer is injured, that consumer can recover for his or her injuries under the tort system, right? Unfortunately, it is very unlikely. There are three basic reasons for this, and all the trial lawyers in the room are gonna follow along with this. It's pretty common sense. First, nano ingredients aren't listed on labels, so a consumer is unlikely to know of the new exposure. Second, as the state of the science is in indeterminacy, a plaintiff will have problems establishing both causation and foreseeability. Third, in the context of cosmetics, food, and dietary supplements, the law has created what is called the idiosyncratic plaintiff defense. You guys heard of that? Idiosyncratic plaintiff defense? Anybody here do any food litigation? No, let me clue you in. I represented a lot of food manufacturers while I was here in Cleveland. And so I actually use this defense on a regular basis. In the context of food, dietary supplements, and cosmetics, a large number of states still follow the reasonable consumer expectation test. This test asks the question of whether the expectations of a reasonable consumer were disappointed. The problem is that if the plaintiff has suffered a unique toxic or allergic reaction, the defense can assert that the expectations of a reasonable consumer haven't been disappointed. It was unique. The defect is in the consumer, not the product. This switches the burden of production onto the plaintiff to show that the reaction is not unique because the plaintiff is part of a substantial class of people who is not part of a substantial class of people who are at risk for the same reaction. Of course, this points to the circularity of the problem. Since nanotech food, dietary supplements, and cosmetics aren't labeled, consumers aren't aware that nanotech particles could be causing any newly developed health problem. Since most consumers aren't aware of their exposures, the consumer and physicians aren't in a position to report any injuries to the FDA or CDC. There is no data collection, so there's no way for a plaintiff to prove that they're part of a substantial class of people who have suffered a similar injury. And even if there was labeling to allow for awareness of exposures and thereby data collection, there are no post-market surveillance systems to collect this data. Finally, for those states that apply risk-utility balancing to show defect, once again, the state of the science is too immature to be able to quantify the level of the risk. The bottom line is I find it unlikely that a savvy plaintiff's lawyer is going to even take the case in the first place. So as you can see, focusing on the degree of hazard makes no sense, as this begs the question, is outcome determinative and leads to the same conclusion every time when it comes to innovative technologies. The bottom line is it leads to little to no regulation until the health risk information void is filled, or there is a public health crisis like the one we're experiencing with vaping and e-cigarettes. Cutting this Gordian knot means that we need a paradigm shift on how we view novel ingredients that have never been seen before in nature. Those who argue that there should be ingredient listing based simply on a consumer's right to know have gained little traction, so a different focus is needed. My thought is that we should switch our focus from hazard to novelty, a bit like the system they use in Europe. How is the European Union handling this issue? Just in the past couple of years, the European Union has started to require these 4 letters bracketed by 2 characters in front of every nano ingredient included in consumer products. If we had a version of the EU system with a focus on novelty, what would that mean to us in the US? It would activate what I call the public health product safety net. If a consumer has an allergic or toxic reaction to a nano ingredient on a product, the consumer can see the nano ingredient listed on the label and see that she has been exposed to a new ingredient. She can then report that she is exposed to that new ingredient to get proper treatment for her injury. The doctor can then report the injury to the FDA and the CDC. The FDA and the CDC can then start to collect data on the relationship between the novel ingredient and any injuries. If the number of injuries grows alarmingly large, like what we have right now in the vaping industry, the CDC or the FDA can initiate a recall before more consumers are injured. This data also supplies the information necessary to establish causation and proximate cause so that injured consumers can bring a cause of action under the tort system. This allows the tort system to act instrumentally to encourage increased investment in safety, properly placing the cost of a loss on the least cost avoider, facilitating cost spreading, and the more efficient production and sale of consumer products to further safeguard public health. So my thought, as I'm wrapping up here, is that nanotech content is material, we should regulate nanotech content based on novelty and the need to engage the government systems to protect and compensate consumers. A focus on novelty, not hazard, triggers the public health product safety net. My look while you leap strategy appears to properly balance all of the stakeholders' interests by protecting public health while encouraging innovation. So my thought is that we shouldn't ban, we should list, and then we should track. Thank you for your time and interest, and I look forward to your comments and questions. So how many folks in this room are aware of how much you're being exposed to nanoparticles? One. Okay. So is it a surprise to you folks that your ties, gentlemen, I see a lot of ties in here, the chairs that you might be sitting on, your cosmetics? I mean, a lot of people, maybe not everybody in the room uses Beyonce lip gloss, right? But a lot of people use chapsticks. You lick your lips a lot, right? Shampoo. Most people shampoo their hair on a regular basis. If you sit in the shower and you're enjoying that wonderful steam, right? You're breathing it in. Oh, that is wonderful. But you're not thinking that you're breathing in nanoparticles, right? And so my question for you folks is, what do you think about the current regulatory system that's not listing the ingredients? And would you be supportive of a system that just had nano before particles or ingredients that had nanotech in it? What do you think? Sir, you have a question.
I just wanted to ask you this question. On one of the examples you pointed out about people that had breathed in?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Breathed in on nanoparticles. Was that established that that was the cause of their problem?
Well, here's what we have, is we have 7 women who were previously healthy. The doctors, at first they came in, at random different times. The doctors didn't associate it with where they worked, but they started doing a forensic analysis because they got a whole group of them into the same hospital. Sort of like what we're happening right with vaping, right? That's the use of e-cigarettes to deliver nicotine. And so the doctors got together and said, wow, this is 7 people coming in with the same symptoms, and this is pretty severe respiratory illness that was progressing very rapidly. And they said, we really need to figure out what's going on. And so they did a background by talking to the women themselves and their families, and they discovered they all had this work history. Then we had some who unfortunately passed away. And then they did pathologies on their tissues to try and figure out what was going on. And they found these pleural effusions, and they found all the nanotech particles in the lungs. The lungs were very inflamed, fibrosis, etc. And at that point, what they said is, because of the commonality, we're going to take the step to say that it is likely that this is from this particular exposure, particularly because they were very healthy beforehand.
Sounds analogous to people that work with asbestos getting cancer.
Yeah, exactly. This is a very small group. And so, at the time, this was before the big rat study that I talked about, where we had 70 scientists from universities across the country all exposing rats to the same particles at the same time, and then doing a forensic examination of their tissues. And now what we see is the same kind of pathology that was discovered in the women's lungs with the bioaccumulation of the particles. We saw the same thing in the rats. So that's where, just to give you a full background on that, they're connecting these two things. They certainly need more studies. And as I said, that's why we are at the tipping point where we say the science is in indeterminates. They know what they need to study. The problem is that, of course, nanoparticles, we think about all the different chemicals that we've got and that we use regularly in consumer products, right? So the kind of nanoparticle that could be engineered is limited only by the imagination of the engineers. And so it's going to be painstaking work to tick through all of the different kind of nanoparticles, like with vaping, with the ingredients that go into the e-liquids. You know, the recipes that are being used for these e-liquids that people are inhaling through their lungs is limited only by the imaginations of the people who are the bakers, right, that are creating all this. And so it's going to take a while. It's going to take some time, and so and we're probably not going to see, because it's going to be if it turns out that this is in fact a problem, it's going to have a very long tail. It's going to be like with cigarettes, where we didn't find out that it was carcinogenic until people had been exposed for decades upon decades. Did I answer your question? Okay. All right. Yes.
Are there any resources out there that the public can get access to inform them at least of the products that are known to have, like you said,
Yes.
content?
Yes, there's a project that was started. I show you one of the graphs here by the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies, PEN, that you can actually go on and you can research, and they actually have a listing of the ones that we are aware of. And the problem is the funding kind of tapered off, and so they weren't able to continue all their more proactive work, but at least they still have a listing of the products where they're able to look at the labels. Consumers are able to look at the labels. If the ingredients were included, nanoparticles that were included, consumers can then report it to PEN, and then they can list it. Importantly, and PEN points this out, is that this isn't, they do a ranking of how accurate it might be, so that they're not disparaging some product manufacturer. And so you need to look at the rankings of how certain they are that nanoparticles in there. There are a lot of people like Nanotech toothpaste who are riding a wave. And these products, these clothes that actually shed dirt, they're actively advertising that they have nanoparticles in them because they want that market of people who want to be ahead of the curve. Something new is sexy and exciting and fun, and who doesn't want to have clothes that shed dirt, right? Or furniture, like if it was in this room, it's used on a regular basis by people that doesn't just shed dirt. There's other public health problems with the seats that you sit on in restaurants over and over and over again. Some of the scientists who are putting together these fabrics that are woven with nano silver are touting the fact that they could be antibacterial, so that when you come in and sit in a public forum where you know that people have been sitting there repeatedly over and over at different times, that you can feel more assured that that fabric doesn't have bacteria in it that you're sitting on, if that makes sense. Yes, sir.
Sorry, just a point of fact. We are webcasting this, so if anyone has any questions, I'll come around.
Oh, thanks, Ray. Thank you very much. Question, sir.
So are there any states that are actually ahead of the curve in thinking about this? So I'm thinking California, for example. Oftentimes they're way ahead in terms of requiring notice and labeling on things. Is that the case or not?
Yeah, I think what we would do is take a look at Prop 65. I am not aware that they have taken any particular steps with nanotech ingredients. And interestingly enough, PEN, the Project on Emerging Nanotechnologies, is based out of California. But I'm not aware that they've taken any steps to put it either on that list of things that are probable carcinogens. And I'm thinking that because of the amount of money that's being poured into the research and development in this area, that just like what we have right now with the environmental controls in California for cars, where the Californians want to have more protection, that if California stepped into that space, we would have another federalism dispute, because the manufacturers, manufacturers are making a lot of money off this stuff, and believe me, when it comes to, by the way, just to set aside, I'm talking about consumer products where there's no pre-market testing. When we're talking about medical products, there has to be pre-market approval. Now that the FDA has recognized that nanoparticles are different and they have a lot of great benefits, the FDA is actually reviewing medical technologies and things that are used to improve our health, therapeutic things. They're reviewing them for that nanotech content. So that's actually happening as we speak. But that's because the FDA has pre-market approval power for therapeutic products. Those things that are targeted to people who are vulnerable because they're suffering from ill health. Did I answer your question? Oh. Other questions? Other things?
This sounds like a train wreck that's about to happen, and the plaintiff's bar is just waiting for it.
I betcha.
If Roundup is any indication, it only takes one verdict, maybe not even that massive. Is the industry doing anything to prepare for this inevitable train wreck? And is there a technological solution to this technological problem?
Oh, I'm going to do the first part of your question first. Because these nanoparticles are engineered, that means that as the science is coming out on the health risks and we're looking at bioreactivity, the engineers aren't just sitting back and saying, oh, this is okay, The engineers are working on trying to come up with safe solutions to try and coat those nanoparticles so that they are not bioreactive in a way that's going to hurt cells. And so they're doing a lot of in vitro studies to see if there's a way that they can jigger things, because all of this is, it's like putting together any other kind of a device, only they're doing it at a nanotech level with chemistry, right? So they can make changes in order to try and make it less bioreactive. The problem is, of course, the less bioreactive it is, the less it's going to be, less potent it is going to be, less useful. So I think of those the materials in our clothes or the paints, the less bioreactive they are, the less able they are going to be to shed dirt. So it's definitely a problem that's on their radar screen. Is industry doing anything about this? I think it's, much like what Juul has been doing to position itself carefully so that it's ready for litigation, ready for the FDA if the FDA starts saying that they can no longer sell Juul e-cigarettes, is that they've limited the distribution to places where you have to be carded, so it can't go to kids. They've limited the number of flavorings, right, in the liquid, so that it's not, they can't, so that there's less a cause for concern about children wanting to have bubblegum flavored vapes. They're being very strategic. They've limited their advertising not to smoking cessation, but to switching, right? Come switch to us. You'll smell better, kind of thing. And so there are people who are out there, there are manufacturers out there who are savvy. They're trying to strategically position themselves so that when this comes, and your point is very well made, that a train wreck waiting to happen. When it comes, that they'll be positioned to be able to continue to put their products out onto the marketplace because they're engaging in precautionary steps. But am I seeing it yet? Is it coming to the surface where somebody like me can see it on the web and in research papers? Not yet. Can I answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. Other question?
I just had a question about labeling. Why is it that they don't have to put the ingredients on there, and then I guess the difference between that and the EU, their labeling standards?
Okay,
and also
nice.
Just kind of considering, since L'Oreal is a European company to my knowledge, is that going to affect how they do things here?
Oh, those are good questions. So let's just start with what the EU is doing. The EU, the European Union, this is why I said my proposal is a little different than the EU. The EU abides by the precautionary principle, right? So that they're like what we do with drugs or other devices that we use when we're marketing them to people with ill health to improve their health, is that they say, until you can prove it's safe, we're not going to allow you to put it on the market, all right? So they follow precautionary principles, and so as they're allowing nanotech ingredients onto the market, they're taking a look at its safety profile, right? And they're requiring people to list it so that they can track it. If in fact they've made a bad decision about safety, that they can track it and pull it off the market right away. A problem that we're having with vaping, right? We don't know what the ingredients are. They're not listed on the labels. We don't have a supply chain so that we can track what these people have been exposed to and pull it off the market. It's the same thing. So the second part of your question is again?
Because they're a European company, how's that going to affect?
Yeah, when we're talking about importing, we're having the same problem with CBD oils at the border, where Canadians right now, Canada has legalized marijuana, and CBD and these products, and so the Canadian citizens have it on their person. They're crossing the border, and they're being stopped at the border because they're importing, as we say, products that are illegal in the United States, and so the federal agents are actually confiscating those products, and they're limiting the individual's ability to return to the United States. And the same thing when you have a manufacturer from outside the United States. If they're bringing something into the United States to distribute it, those products have to comply with the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. And so because they're listing it in Europe and it's on the labels, they will comply with the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, which right now is not requiring ingredient listing at all. So they're not having a problem at the border because they're doing more than what the United States requires with regard to consumer protection. Did that answer that question? All right, good. Good. It really is, when we're talking about labeling, it really can be an interesting logistical problem or concern. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm curious, is there a group now working on getting regulations done in this era of not caring about health and safety, environment, etc.?
Well, certainly we have consumer advocacy groups that are advocating for these kinds of products to have, to list their ingredients on labels. We've got groups that are sort of more on I'm in the middle. I believe in innovation, encouraging innovation. We want people to innovate. There are a lot of these products that are going to make a very big difference to our lives. So I want folks to be spending money to innovate, create these new products. But I also want to list it so that we can track it and keep track of whether it's causing problems to our population. And then there's consumer groups who want to ban it entirely, right? Who just think it shouldn't be on the market at all. And so we have consumer groups out there that are doing this kind of work and advocating. It's interesting, I don't know if you folks are aware of this, but even with pre-market approval for drugs that are very bioreactive, right? But we want them to be because they're helping us to get better. 50% of the adverse effects that we see with drugs, we only see them after they've been distributed onto the market. So in testing, it's just a very small group of people they test these drugs on over a very short period of time. We then introduce the drugs to the market, to the genetic diversity of over 300 million people, and then we start seeing problems occur. And that's when we start getting the black box warnings, or we see recalls. And that's part of the whole cycle. And it's expected, the FDA understands that, and that's why they say it's very important for us to list the ingredients on labels, that they're distributed by the physicians through prescriptions so that we can keep track of these very bioreactive ingredients so that if we're seeing a problem in the population, that we can recall them. We're seeing that right now with various drugs that are causing some cardiac problems. But we only see that because we have the FDA reporting system in place because the physicians know very well what's in those ingredients, and they have patients who start having problems, cardiac problems, they report it to the CDC. The CDC and the FDA are then aware of it, and then they can engage in heightened vigilance by sending letters out to doctors to say, hey, look, here's some of the symptoms we're seeing with this drug, be on alert. And then if it continues, the FDA can issue warnings to individuals, the consumers, so they can self-protect, and they can make a decision. Hey, I'd rather take this other drug that may have some other side effects I'm not really comfortable with, but at least they're not going to kill me, right? And I still want to have the advantages of having a medication. And so it really puts more control in the hands of the consumer to self-protect, to engage in individual choices to what they're going to put in their bodies. And of course, we haven't even talked about what we're doing as far as the commons. The nanosilver, one of the biggest nanoparticles that is being used. It's beyond the scope of my presentation day, but it's being used in a lot of products, and where is it ending up? We're washing it off our bodies, we're washing our clothes, we put it all into our water, and then it's bioaccumulating in the water. And what is it doing to our good bacteria in the water? Well, it's highly antibacterial, so it's killing off the bacteria in our water. It's then, of course, fish are ingesting this through the fact that they're in that environment. And so we're seeing these kinds of particles bioaccumulate, much like the microplastics, right? Everybody heard about the little tiny microplastics? We can visually see those though, right? So consumers are more aware of this happening rather than the nanoparticles, which are in many ways far, far more bioreactive, that are accumulating in larger amounts because we're using them more. The little microplastics were being used in what I would say is a comparatively smaller group of products. Yes, sir? Oh.
Cleveland has been the home of 2 or 3 of the plaintiffs' bar asbestos litigators, and 2 or 3 of its major law firms have been national or regional defense counsel. If the, what do I call them, multi-walled carbon nanotubes operate like asbestos fibers, are we in a position to maybe have another explosive growth in that litigation here in Cleveland? And
Yeah.
do you see yourself being called as an expert witness at some point in the inevitable train wreck?
Thank you for your questions. I don't see myself as being a witness because I would say that I would be more of a consultant on how to put the lawsuit together. The product liability law itself, I'm definitely not an expert in the science. There are a lot of nationally known experts who are currently researching multi-walled carbon nanotubes. And the question becomes, at what point either we have a situation where the nanoparticles bioaccumulate to the point where we're going to see injuries, or we're going to have a situation where the FDA has enough science that they can start regulating it, in which case we're going to see something very similar to lead paint, right? Where it's going to be a foreseeability question. And so, interestingly enough, this is likely to have a very long tail. It's not likely that we're going to see these kinds of situations for a very long time. But I would suggest for those people who have allergies to things, people who are sensitive to toxins, there's a genetic vulnerability that they have. So they're a bit like the canaries in the coal mine, right? So if you have hyperallergenicity syndrome, or you have allergies, or your skin gets easily, gets rash from being exposed to various things, you are likely, I don't know, right? Speculation on my part, but those people would likely be the first people who we would see pop up as the canaries in the coal mine, showing some kinds of exposures. It's the same thing that we're seeing right now with some of the dental materials that we use. We've got a lot of very innovative dental materials, and we're slowly seeing individuals who are having problems with those dental materials pop up, and usually these people are pretty sensitive to chemical exposures. Did I answer your question? Okay, wonderful.
Professor Van Tassel, thank you so very much for coming over and explaining very interesting things about this very new and still very great subject. Thank you for that. Let's talk about FDA. It's a notoriously poor agency. not many resources there. It's also a reactive kind of an agency, considering the history of FDA. What can you say in terms of predicting how soon do you think that FDA will be strong enough and will get the right position to really start intervening in this issue, which is becoming larger and larger as time passes? You know?
That's a wonderful question. This is Ms. Maris, everybody. Ms. Maris is a student in my food and drug law class right now. She's a practicing lawyer in Cleveland and has been for a long time. And thank you for being here, Ms. Maris. When we say the FDA is a poor agency, I think you mean that they have very few resources. They work very hard, they're very diligent, and as you can see about what's going on in the country right now, they have a lot of issues on their plate. And they have very limited resources. And so they're reactive because they always are putting out fires, right? They're always something else, a new technology will come on to the scene, you know, like the thalidomide crisis, right? It's something that they have not been, it hasn't been on their radar screen because they've been putting resources in other areas. And then they'll have a whole group of individuals who start becoming ill, and they have to react to that. And unfortunately, that's why we have sort of a patchwork of food, drug, and cosmetic laws. It's hard to learn Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, how it works without taking a class, because most of the changes, the major changes to the statute have been reactive to some public health crisis. And so they don't have the resources. They're continuously putting out fires. I believe very strongly that they're doing the best that they can with what they've been given. But as I said, in this particular situation, the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act is very clear, and you'll like this, Ms. Meredith, we'll put it all together, is that first, they only have pre-market approval for drugs and devices, basically. And now, of course, cigarettes to a certain extent as well. And so they're pretty much, their hands are tied until they get to the point where they can identify a hazard, right? And they have the burden of proof. They actually have to prove, you know, the causation before they can take any actions. And so if you guys followed ephedrine and the ephedrine crisis in dietary supplements, it took years before the FDA was finally able to pull that off the market. It's unfortunate that also the EPA under TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, are specifically told you do not have jurisdiction over dietary supplements, cosmetics, and food. That's the FDA. So you can't do it either, EPA. And so their hands are kind of tied right now because of the regulatory scheme, because the way things have come together over the years, like I said, in reaction to public health crises, we have now a space or a void where there isn't regulation and the FDA can't regulate. And should it put its, right now, when it's uncertain and we're not seeing a whole bunch of people being very sick and dying, should they put their resources into years and years of litigation like they did with ephedra, and with an uncertain response because we don't have enough science yet, right? Or should they be putting their resources into discovering what's going on with vaping and getting a handle on regulating e-cigarettes, THC, CBD, cannabis oil, and those other kinds of products. And my thought is it's likely that the powers that be are putting their resources right now where the current public health crisis is and where the problem is with the regulation of medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, CBD, hemp, all that other kind of stuff. I think, Ray, are we out of time now? Wonderful. Listen, you've been a wonderful audience. I really appreciate it. Great questions. Thank you so much for being here this morning, and thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks to you.